Out on the ridge, wildfire devoured everything they'd buried. 7 tiny graves, a house that hadn't heard a baby's cry in 10 years. But that night, as flames roared through the pines and smoke turned the sky purple, a lone rancher did what no one thought he would. He carried a young woman heavy with new life straight through the fire. Inside a crumbling stone hut, wind rattled the walls. Sparks fell like burning snow. "Don't you die on me now," he whispered, voice cracked but steady. And the woman, through clenched teeth, gasped, "We don't break, not tonight." Her screams tore through the dark, until a newborn's first cry rose from the ashes. They say miracles don't bloom on scorched earth, but that night, hope was born in that blaze. The wind hit Sadie Harper's face like a slap, sharp with dust, and the bitter tang of smoke drifting in from the ridge. She stood barefoot on the warped wooden porch, toes curled around the splintered planks as if her bones could hold back the world that wanted to swallow her whole. Out there, beyond the black line of pines, the sky burned in shades of violent orange and bruised purple, the color of a wound that never healed. She pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the baby shift under her skin, restless and alive in a way that made her heart hurt. 8 months. That's what she'd counted, curled up on the dirt floor of a shack behind the feed store, before Thorne Callahan showed up with 2 tarnished coins and eyes that looked right through her mother's lies. Now the baby was her only warmth in this stretch of nowhere, and the only thing she had left to lose. The porch boards creaked as the wind howled around the eaves. Smoke rolled low along the grass like a predator sniffing for prey. She could taste it at the back of her throat. Dry, acidic, promising to take more than the ghosts buried up on the ridge. Sadie's hair lashed across her cheek, sticking to the sweat on her skin. She hadn't cut it since before Dry Creek, before she'd slammed the door on that boarding house with whiskey on the tables, and men's hands always reaching. The long, dark strands tangled and snapped in the wind now, wild as the fire creeping closer. Behind her, the house loomed, a sagging thing of gray boards and stubborn quiet. There were no flowers in the yard, no fence to stop what came. Just the stones laid out on the ridge like crooked teeth, 7 of them, each marker a child Thorne had laid to rest, while the world kept whispering that some men should stay alone forever. She had heard the stories in town. They all said he was cursed, or worse, that he was a man so empty he'd pay for a pregnant girl just to drown out the silence. But out here, standing in the path of smoke and ash, Sadie didn't feel like someone who'd been bought. She felt like the last thing standing between this child and the fire that wanted to bury both of them next. A crack echoed up from the distant tree line, a branch splitting under the heat. She flinched, one hand flying to the railing, knuckles white against the dark grain. The wind shifted again, carrying sparks that floated like angry fireflies. Some died before they touched the ground. Others landed and smoldered, threatening to catch. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "You should run," the voice inside her whispered. The same voice that had told her to run from Maeve's shackles, from the sawdust floors of that boarding house, from every man who ever spat promises while weighing her worth like cattle. But where would she run now? To the ridge where 7 tiny crosses waited to remind her that even the strongest love can be eaten alive by flame? To the dirt road that would lead her back to the townsfolk who'd rather turn their eyes than lend a hand? No, not this time. She wasn't running anymore. Inside, she could hear Thorne's boots pacing the front room. Heavy, deliberate. He didn't curse the wind or the fire. He didn't plead with the sky. Just moved with the same slow purpose that had carried her up onto that horse the day he'd paid her mother more than she was worth. That day, she'd thought she'd traded one cage for another. Tonight, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd traded death for a chance to stand here and fight. A gust blew up from the valley, fierce enough to lift the hem of her nightdress and sting her eyes with grit. She blinked, squinting against the ember glow flickering at the edge of the woods. Any minute now, the trees would burst like dry bones cracking in a fire pit. Any minute, the sky would rain sparks down on this porch, this roof, this life she hadn't asked for, but wasn't ready to give up. Sadie pressed her hand firmer against her belly. The baby kicked, a defiant, desperate sign that life still pulsed in this place where everything else seemed ready to burn. She drew a breath that tasted of smoke and pine sap and fear, and under it, somewhere deep in her ribs, hope flickered too. Fragile, but bright. The fire was coming. She was ready. Thorne Callahan didn't say a word when he stepped out onto the porch. He didn't have to. The roar of the fire was closer now, a low, hungry growl that shook the ground beneath their bare feet. Sparks rose behind him like a swarm of fireflies gone rabid, catching on the edge of his shirt as he dropped the last of the wet blankets at Sadie's feet. Sadie met his eyes, the same eyes that had watched her sleep these past weeks without ever crossing the line she thought every man would. Eyes so dark they seemed to drink in every flicker of flame and give nothing back but a steady promise. "I will get you through this." She tried to stand on her own, the weight of her belly dragging her forward. Her legs buckled before she made it halfway to the edge of the porch. Thorne caught her before her knees hit the boards, his rough hands slipping under her thighs and shoulders as if she weighed nothing at all. "Don't you drop me," she managed, her voice hoarse from the smoke. A shadow of a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real sign of life she'd seen there since he brought her to this broken house. "I won't drop you, Sadie Harper. Not tonight." He shifted her closer to his chest, the damp wool blanket between them already dripping onto the porch floor. The wind picked up, blasting hot against the back of his neck as the fire snapped and cracked down the slope. From here, the trail looked like a thin promise winding through the trees. A promise the fire wanted to eat alive before they ever reached the old stone hut buried in the hollow. Sadie could feel his heartbeat hard and fast against her ribs. She pressed her forehead into his collarbone as the first wave of smoke rolled over them, making her gag. He didn't slow down. One step off the porch and he was moving, boots pounding through the brittle grass, his breath a ragged echo in her ear. The forest closed in quick. Pines loomed on either side, their needles hissing as sparks caught and flared. Branches cracked overhead, falling like burning spears into the dry brush below. Thorne ducked under a low limb, turning his shoulder to shield her belly from the flying cinders. Sadie tried not to look at the flames licking up the trunks to her right, tried not to think about what would happen if he stumbled, if the wind turned the wrong way, if the old hut was already gone by the time they reached it. But fear was a stubborn thing. It clung to her bones, rattling around in the space where she used to believe no man could be trusted to carry her anywhere but down. A roar erupted behind them, louder than a gunshot. A tree split in two, crashing across the trail they'd just crossed. The blast of heat that followed burned the soles of Thorne's boots through to his skin, but he didn't stop. Didn't curse. He just adjusted his grip, muscles bunching under Sadie's arm as he shifted her weight higher. "Thorne!" she gasped as another contraction twisted her belly tight. Pain shot down her spine. Her vision blurred. I can't breathe." "You can," he growled. He dipped his head, pressing his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the roar. "You hear me, Sadie? You breathe. You hold on." She did what he said because there was nothing else to do. Her fingers clawed at the wet blanket draped across his shoulders, pulling it tighter around them as if that scrap of wool could keep the fire out and the baby in. The trail narrowed, the earth beneath them turning slick with ash and pine needles. Every step Thorne took jolted through her body, rattling the baby like a seed in a dry gourd. She tasted blood where she'd bitten her lip to keep from screaming. Through the haze of smoke and falling sparks, she saw the faint outline of the old stone hut, squat and low, half buried in the slope ahead. It looked like salvation and a grave all at once. "Almost there," Thorne rasped. He stumbled, knees nearly buckling when a gust of fire-hot wind slammed them sideways. His boots skidded over loose earth, but he righted himself, gritting his teeth against the strain. Sadie forced her eyes open, blinking past the tears. She saw the sweat pouring down his neck, the way his jaw clenched with each breath that rattled his chest. He'd carried 7 children to the ridge before, buried them in boxes no bigger than a saddlebag. But tonight, she thought, he was carrying something more than her weight. He was carrying the last piece of himself that hadn't burned away yet. A shower of sparks rained down as a branch overhead gave way. Thorne shielded her with his back, the blanket hissing where embers died against damp wool. In that moment, through the firestorm and the fear, Sadie heard the words tumble out of her cracked lips. Words she hadn't dared believe until now. "We don't break," she breathed. Not tonight. Thorne didn't answer. He just bent his head, grit and sweat dripping from his brow, and pushed through the final yards toward the stone hut, straight into the mouth of the blaze that refused to swallow them whole. The door to the old stone hut banged open on a gust of wind so fierce it nearly tore it off its rusted hinges. Thorne Callahan ducked inside with Sadie in his arms, the damp blanket trailing ash and sparks behind them. He kicked the door shut with his boot, blocking out the roar of the wildfire for now, though the smoke still crept in through the cracks between the stones like a ghost that refused to leave them alone. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The walls were rough-hewn rock, patched with clay in places where time and weather had eaten away at them. A single oil lamp flickered on a rickety shelf, its flame guttering every time the wind rattled the door. The smell of old straw and dry earth wrapped around Sadie like another blanket. Scratchy, musty, but real. Solid. Still here when everything outside was turning to cinders. Thorne lowered her gently onto the straw-strewn floor, his knees popping as he bent down. He moved with a carefulness that made her chest tighten. A man used to holding things he knew might break at the slightest touch. He brushed a strand of sweat-soaked hair from her forehead, his fingertips leaving streaks of ash across her skin. "You stay with me, Sadie Harper," he said, his voice rough but steady. "This baby's coming. Nothing's stopping that now." Sadie tried to nod, but her neck felt too heavy. Another wave of pain seized her belly, sharper than the fire outside, and she bit back a scream. Her hands clawed at the straw, at his coat, at anything solid enough to hold her down so the pain wouldn't lift her right out of her body. Thorne pulled the bucket of water closer. Water he'd hauled to this hut in the good years when hope still felt like something you could keep alive with strong hands and prayers. He dipped a rag into it, the cold wetness stinging his cracked knuckles, and pressed it to Sadie's burning forehead. She shivered. "It's too soon," she rasped. Her voice was hoarse from the smoke and the screams caught in her throat. "I ain't ready." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek, smearing soot across pale skin. "Ain't nobody ever ready," he said. "You just do it anyway." The wind howled outside, rattling the crooked door. Embers danced in the cracks between the stones, glowing like tiny eyes watching them. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut. She could still see the ridge burning behind her lids, the trees splitting, the sky gone purple-black with ash. But here in this hut, there was no room for the fire to follow. No room for ghosts either. "Tell me something," she gasped, fighting through another contraction that ripped through her spine like barbed wire. "Anything." Thorne glanced around the hut, at the old milking stool overturned in the corner, the bundles of dried herbs long turned to dust, the iron hooks still embedded in the wall where someone once hung lanterns or dreams. He didn't want to lie, didn't know how. "You remember the rose bushes?" he asked, voice low. "By the fence back home?" Sadie cracked an eye open, forced a tiny nod. She'd seen the withered stalks, the broken trellis leaning like a drunk against the wind. "Planted those for her," he said, dipping the rag again and brushing her collarbone where sweat pooled. 7 times she thought they'd take. 7 times we buried another one instead." Sadie's breath caught on a sob. She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, just let her grip it until her nails dug into his palm. "But this one's different," he said, leaning close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath over the chill. "This one's coming. You hear that?" We're going to hear her cry. Another pain hit, so deep she thought it might split her open. She arched her back, the straw scratching her skin, the walls pressing in like stone tombs. "I can't," she gasped, but Thorne cut her off, pressing his forehead to hers. "Yes, you can. Don't you tell me you can't, Sadie Harper. You already walked through fire." A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracing a line through the soot on her cheek. Outside, a branch cracked and fell, sparks flying past the tiny window slit. The smell of burning sap seeped in, mixing with the sharp tang of sweat and old stone. But inside that hut, the oil lamp glowed warmer now, its flame licking at the dark like a promise that hadn't been broken yet. Thorne grabbed the frayed quilt from the corner, the one his wife stitched long ago when they still believed in springtime. He tucked it around Sadie's trembling legs, his fingers brushing the swelling curve of her belly. She was so small beneath all that life, so fierce and so breakable all at once. The next scream tore out of her before she could catch it. Thorne held her hand tight enough she could feel his pulse hammering in time with her own. "I'm scared," she whispered, voice raw. Her eyes found his, searching for something that wouldn't burn away. "What if I can't do this?" He shook his head, one rough thumb wiping at the corner of her mouth. "You're doing it, Sadie. Right here. Right now. Ain't no what if." Somewhere in the walls, the wind moaned like a woman mourning. But under it, she heard something else. A heartbeat stronger than her own, fighting its way out of the dark. She clung to his hand, eyes locked on the lamp's wavering flame, and she felt it deep in her bones. If the fire wanted to swallow them, it'd have to take hope with it. And tonight she wasn't giving her up. Sadie's scream tore through the stone hut like a blade splitting old wood. Her fingernails dug half-moons into Thorne's wrist. Her eyes squeezed shut against the world that seemed determined to break her open from the inside out. Sweat poured down her temples, slicking her hair against her cheeks in damp, dark strands. Outside, the fire still raged somewhere in the trees. But inside this circle of rough stone, there was only this: straw, blood, breath, and the wild, unstoppable push of new life. "Almost there," Thorne rasped, his own voice frayed raw. His knees ached from kneeling so long on the cold earth, but he didn't dare let go of her hand. He'd buried too many children on this ridge to let this one slip away without a fight. He could feel Sadie's pulse racing under his thumb. Fast, defiant. It gave him hope in a way he hadn't felt in a decade. Sadie's whole body arched like a bow pulled taut, a sob catching in her throat before it broke into a grunt of pure primal determination. She wasn't the girl who'd been sold behind the feed store anymore. She wasn't Maeve's throwaway daughter, traded for whiskey and 2 tarnished coins. She was Sadie Harper, the woman who'd walked through wildfire and carried her child right through the flames. Another wave of pain rolled through her, white-hot and merciless. She gasped for air, head tossing from side to side as the oil lamp flickered above them, its soft glow turning the sweat on her skin to a sheen of gold. "I can't," she panted. Her grip slipped, fingers scrabbling for something, anything to anchor her. "You can," Thorne growled, leaning closer, his forehead almost touching hers. His other hand worked quickly, adjusting the old quilt beneath her hips, whispering rough encouragements that caught in the cracks of his voice. "Sadie, listen to me. You're doing it. You're doing what she never could." Sadie's eyes flew open, wet and wide, locking on his. "What if it's like before?" she choked out. "What if she don't cry?" Thorne's jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, the old grief flickered in his eyes like a ghost. 7 graves on the ridge, a wife's laughter swallowed by the dirt. But then he shook his head, fierce and final. "This one will cry," he said. "I swear it. She's coming into this world fighting, just like her mama." Sadie braced her heels against the straw, shoulders pressing back into the cool stone floor. Another contraction hit like a hammer, and she screamed again. This time not in fear, but in fury, in defiance of every whisper that said she wouldn't survive this night. Time stretched and collapsed, seconds melting into hours until the only measure of the world was the beat of her heart and the rise of her breath. Thorne worked beside her, his broad hands steady even when his eyes burned with unshed tears. He mopped her brow with the same rag he'd dipped in the bucket hours before, his voice a rough lullaby that made the shadows retreat, if only for a moment. Then all at once, there it was, a sound sharper than the wind outside, stronger than the crackle of embers, a tiny, raw cry that cut through the hush like a knife made of light. Sadie's head fell back, a sob tearing loose from her throat. Part relief, part disbelief, all love. She barely felt the sting as Thorne pressed the damp bundle against her chest, his calloused hands so gentle they made her want to weep all over again. "There she is," he murmured, voice breaking. "You did it, Sadie. You did it." Sadie's hands trembled as she cradled the tiny body against her skin. The baby was red and slick and impossibly small, but her lungs were fierce, each breath a defiant wail that echoed off the stone walls. Her little hand flexed, fingers curling around Sadie's collarbone like a claim on this world. "She's perfect," Sadie whispered, tears streaming down her temples into the straw. "God, she's so perfect." Thorne sank back on his haunches, wiping his palms on his trousers, though there was nothing clean left in him. He watched the way Sadie's shoulders curled protectively around the child, how her face, exhausted, tear-streaked, still smudged with soot, glowed softer than the lamplight. "You hear that?" he said hoarsely. He could barely get the words past the knot in his throat. "That cry. I've waited so damn long to hear that." Sadie lowered her head, pressing her lips to the baby's damp crown. The smell of new life, salt and milk and something like wild roses, chased out the acrid bite of smoke that clung to her hair. "She's ours," she breathed. It felt strange on her tongue, but right too. Not Maeve's, not the world's. Ours. Outside, the wind shifted. The flames, once a roar pressing in on every side, began to fade into the distance. A low crackle that sounded smaller, tamed somehow by the soft hush of new breath. Sadie stared at the baby's tiny hands splayed over her skin. Each finger, each wrinkle, a promise that life could bloom even on scorched earth. She felt Thorne's hand hover at her shoulder before it settled there. Heavy, warm, anchoring her to this place, this moment. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. In the small circle of lamplight, with the storm outside dying into embers, Sadie Harper felt the weight of every mile she'd run from. Every cruel hand, every cold stare, every chain Maeve ever locked around her wrist. All of it burned away now in the cradle of her arms. Hope had come through fire, and she would not let go. Morning found them in that battered stone hut, the first pale light sliding through the crooked door and spilling across the straw-strewn floor. It touched Sadie's bare shoulder, warmed the curve of her cheek, and glowed soft over the tiny bundle curled against her chest. Hope slept there, small as a promise, her breath rising and falling in steady little puffs that chased the smell of smoke out of Sadie's mind. One tiny hand rested over Sadie's heartbeat, proof that some things once broken could grow back if you were stubborn enough to hold on. Beside her, Thorne Callahan leaned against the wall, boots stretched out, hat resting in his lap. Ash clung to his collar, the smoke stains in his beard turning the lines on his face even starker in the dawn light. He hadn't shut his eyes for more than a heartbeat, though every part of him begged for sleep. Every few moments he glanced down at Hope, as if needing to remind himself she was still real, that the night hadn't swallowed her up like it had everything else. Outside, the land was quiet. No crackle of flames, no roar of wind, just the soft hiss of embers dying under a sky turning gold. The trees that ringed the clearing stood like blackened bones, but behind them the ridge still held its shape. Stubborn, scarred, but standing. Sadie drew in a breath, tasting the air that drifted in through the door. Charred wood, wet earth, and something new that smelled like rain yet to come. She brushed her lips over Hope's hair, felt the warmth of her daughter's skin, and let the ache in her bones settle into something almost peaceful. "You should rest," she murmured, voice rough but soft, turning to look at Thorne. He let out a low breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Can't. Might miss it." "Miss what?" He tipped his chin toward Hope, his eyes tired but clear. "That sound. Been waiting too damn long to hear her breathe." Sadie's eyes burned, but this time the tears didn't taste like sorrow. She reached out, covering Thorne's rough hand where it rested on her shoulder. Outside these walls, the world would talk. Call her names, say she'd been bought and saved for reasons they'd never understand. But here, in the hush of morning, none of that mattered. The land was still, the fire was gone, and the ridge would bloom again. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it would. Sadie looked down at Hope's sleeping face and felt it like a vow in her chest. They'd hold on. This time they wouldn't break. Sometimes the hardest ground grows the strongest roots. That's true on a lonely ridge in the Wild West. And it's true now in a world that can feel just as unforgiving. Sadie and Thorne's story reminds us that even when the past tries to chain us down, even when others decide our worth for us, there's still hope if we're willing to fight for it. In America today, we still see folks judged for who they were or where they came from. We see families torn apart, good people left alone with nothing but ghosts for company. Maybe you know what that feels like. Maybe you've had to walk through your own fire to protect the thing you love most. This story asks, what are you willing to carry through the flames? Who or what do you plant your hope in, even when the world burns? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear what lessons you see here. Have you ever seen something beautiful grow from a place everyone else gave up on? Thank you for listening, truly. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of resilience, redemption, and the quiet miracles that still live out on the frontier, and maybe in your own backyard too. Stay strong,